Good evening and welcome to this latest episode of the Pandemic Podcast, where tonight I ask the question, what did Professor David Thunder say to get kicked off Twitter? David is our second guest to score a hat trick of appearances on the Pandemic Podcast this week after my session with Nick Hudson on Monday. But the last time that today's guest joined me on the Pandemic Podcast, you could find him on multiple social media channels. That all changed last week when this respected academic saw his Twitter account with over 25,000 followers permanently suspended without any reasonable explanation or even possible right of appeal. Dr. David Thunder is a researcher and lecturer in moral, political, and social philosophy at the University of Navarra's Institute for Culture and Society. He last joined me in August when we were pondering whether it was too late to save democracy. Well, having lost 25,000 Twitter followers in the blink of an eye and receiving, by the way of an explanation, no more than a pithy message accusing one of propagating false or misleading information on COVID-19 certainly serves to focus the mind. And to be on the receiving end of big tech censorship is to see its stunning impact on up close. So the question expands today to say, now, how does he see our chances now in the light of this myriad of draconian global measures in the context of this cancel culture that we've seen around public debate around COVID-19, especially being on the receiving end of this? So I welcome David back to unpick all of this, see where he thinks what impact this cancel culture has on within the pandemic and explore the concept more broadly. So David, welcome back to the Pandemic Podcast for your latest appearance.
Thank you, Dan. It's great to be back.
So what on earth does a respected academic such as yourself, who I have to say has been one of the most reasonable guests we have on the show? You know, we do have some people that go off into territory where I have to go and pull people back and say, well, I don't know whether there's any evidence there. You know, you've been one of the most consistent people that I've interviewed on the show, but also I've taken great value from your commentary, from your scope of expertise across your social media platforms. So what on earth does a respective academic like yourself do to be not only wrist slapped by a social media company, but actually deplatformed? Could you explain what happened?
Well, it's a long story, but the short version is that what sparked the expulsion from Twitter was a certain tweet that I sent around a week ago, more or less, to the effect that a certain drug was being effectively used in many parts of the world to treat COVID-19. I understand that we're being monitored by YouTube, so I'm not going to name the drug in question, but I expressed an informed opinion about the efficacy of said drug. And I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist, I'm a philosopher, political philosopher. But just as many journalists and academics who are not doctors express opinions against that particular drug, I am also free to express an opinion in favor of that drug. And my opinion was informed, I should mention, by the analysis of certain medical researchers and experts, such as Tess Lawrie in the United Kingdom, who is highly qualified analyst and doctor, and she has many published papers, and she has advised the World Health Organization in providing them with medical evidence to help inform their decisions. So she's not just some random person that we picked off the street. She's a highly qualified analyst and a medical researcher. And she is one of the advocates of this particular drug. And I was quite influenced by her discussions and her arguments. And without going into more detail, other physicians and other experts also influenced my judgment. But apparently that was violated Twitter's misinformation policy. Which policy was, they have a policy against misinformation about COVID-19, which false or misleading information. So basically they pounced on that tweet and sent me a message and shut down my account. And the message basically said, you have violated our policy, our rule against COVID-19 misinformation. I naturally appealed the decision, and I very rapidly, probably within at least, say, 2 days, I got a quick response from them, basically saying that I was permanently suspended from their platform for what they called repeat violations of their rules. So it wasn't actually just what I said about that particular drug that got me kicked off Twitter. It was apparently a history of saying things that they found to be a violation of their rules. So I trawled back over my Twitter history. I pulled out all of the warnings from Twitter for various things I had said. And I was surprised that the things I said were actually quite mild, I would say, and quite conservative. I mean, I never, just to give an example, I never said that people should not take the vaccine in general. I never said that the vaccine was ineffective in general. I think I might have raised some certain question marks about certain aspects of the vaccination campaigns. Again, I'm being a little bit coy about this because I don't want to spark the censor again. But I think people can probably look back over my history and my articles to see what I think about vaccination, even if I don't say it straight out here. But I will say this much: I'm not anti-vaccination, and I do believe vaccinations have probably have quite an important role to play in dealing with this with COVID-19. And in let's say, reducing the harms of COVID-19. That's my personal opinion. But I think what shocked me was just that that Twitter would single out a few statements, a handful of statements like this, and then basically sink my account, destroy my account with absolutely no explanation. I mean, this is what perhaps we could talk about due process or whatever procedures Twitter has in place. All they do is they just say you are guilty of misinformation.
Yes.
They don't tell you what part of your tweet, what statement violates the rules. They never mention that. You just have to kind of guess what you're charged with. They never actually specify the charge in relation to a specific statement. So it's really just a mock trial, as far as I could tell, where some people in Twitter decide they don't like a tweet and they send you a few warnings, and then they suspend your account. There's no further explanation.
Yes. I've experienced the same cancel culture deplatforming for the same drug on YouTube. I've had to subsequently set up a new YouTube account, which I've been able to do. In fact, I had an old YouTube account that I've now reverted to, where I have to be very careful. And as we explained before we even started this conversation, that the fact is we can't even talk about the specific drug in the context of censorship where we wouldn't need to go into any of the science and the discussion, but we can't even talk about it using the terms for fear of getting censored, which in itself, David, I'd be interested in your comment on, and the fact that you can't even talk around the subject and the implications this has for the public sphere. Because the fact that, I mean, I've already seen some guesses in the comments, and I'm even worried now. Someone made the point: what if we use the word too many times in the comments? Is that gonna cause a flag and get the content banned? But here we are talking about the censorship in the context of it. So, I mean, how does this whole situation make you feel in seeing this?
Yeah. Well, it's worrying to me. It's quite worrying to me because one of the steps that can be taken, one of the symptoms that a political system is heading down a path towards totalitarianism is when very severe forms of censorship are introduced. In this case, what's curious about this particular form of censorship is that it's actually exercised by private companies. But the effect of this censorship is to silence certain voices in the public sphere, because these private companies, effectively provide the infrastructure of our public sphere, or a very large part of the infrastructure of our public sphere. So Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, these are platforms that dominate the public sphere. So the rules they set, the way they regulate their particular public spheres, are not just a matter of private censorship. They're they're a form of public censorship de facto, because they condition, they set the conditions under which public discourse proceeds. So, for example, there have been testimonies in front of the U.S. Senate, in front of the Texas Congress, I believe, or House of Representatives, that have been taken down by YouTube. So very important public acts that are important for citizens are being censored and taken down. I associate this with dictatorial regimes, and I think that what people have great difficulty with, some people have a lot of difficulty with, is understanding the difference between disagreeing with somebody and thinking they should be shut down.
Yes.
This is a very, very important difference. So, for example, there are going to be a lot of people who do not agree with my take on, say, treatments for COVID, or on, say, vaccination, or on the use of masks, right? These kinds of issues. And so they should be able to, in a democracy, they should be able to respectfully disagree with me, but still allow me to have my say, and to give me a fair hearing. Even if they want to refute my views, or if they want to object to my views, that's fair enough in a democracy. But now, increasingly, you hear people saying things like, shut him down, I wish Twitter would just shut down his account, these kinds of comments. And then after the fact, I've been able to peer into Twitter and see sort of some reactions. And the kinds of reactions you hear sometimes from some people are, it's about time he was shut down. It's a good thing that finally he's been shut down and we can't hear his voice anymore. And this is a very short-sighted and sectarian view of censorship and democracy, because the very person who is saying that could be the next person in line to be the object of censorship. It's so short-sighted to think that it's a good thing to censor your enemies, or even to view your adversaries in a discourse as your enemies who need to be shut down. What's the next step? I mean, if you shut them down on their platforms, if you exclude them from the public sphere, presumably the next step is to file criminal sanctions against them, possibly to even arrest them. I mean, if we go down that line and say that they don't have the right to participate in public discourse on an equal footing. So I think the price we pay for this is huge, because ultimately the price we pay is truth and discovery of truth. Because when you artificially exclude voices that you don't like from the public sphere, you end up basically losing opportunities, forfeiting opportunities to have your opinions be tested, put to the test by people who may not agree with them. And that is how our opinions are refined over time. They need to be put to the test, they need to be examined. But when the public sphere becomes very lopsided and censored, and when one opinion becomes privileged and gets a free pass all the time, constantly, then you don't have a vibrant, genuinely vibrant, two-sided argument, and common beliefs are not properly put to the test.
Well, the point of two-sided argument is an interesting one, because two things I witness happen, particularly in the context of the pandemic. I know there's lots of broader discussion around cancel culture in the modern world and various other things around political correctness, which we may or may not touch on. But within the pandemic, within the scope of kind of where the show has been focused, it seems that censorship, deplatforming, the tide only flows in one direction. There's, as you mentioned, there could be someone saying the opposite of what you're saying, which could be factually incorrect, misleading, or misinformation, but somehow goes unscathed. It's not affected in the same way. It's only the critical voices, the counter narrative, that is deplatformed, that is cancelled. But similarly, even the same is true with the fact checkers. The fact checker sites, and some of those are funded by these social media giants. But again, the fact checkers only ever go in one direction, and there's been some flagrant misinformation on mainstream news, which is just false. In fact, you could argue that much of what the government pops out is not an accurate representation. There's been certain misrepresentation of information amongst governments, but you never see that censored or taken down or fact checked. So we have this one-way flow of information, which means that we don't ever have that debate, because it's this hegemonist kind of view on information. What's your take on this blatant, what feels like blatant bias?
Yeah, I think that it proves if in case we needed any evidence for this, it reaffirms the view that basically when you hand the power of censorship to any actor, that it's liable to abuse, and the way in which it's exercised is likely to be informed by the peculiar idiosyncratic beliefs and ideologies of the censor. It's a kind of a myth that we have that has been propagated by Facebook, Twitter, and indeed governments, that there are some people who can stand above the public sphere, can stand above the fray of the dirty fray of discourse and debate, and can, from the mightiness of their intellect and their expertise, that they can look down on us mere mortals who are discussing and debating these issues, and they can decide this person is guilty of misinformation, and this person and this person and this person. This issue has been settled, so therefore there should be no further dispute. And it's almost like a godlike quality that is attributed to these censors. And in the specific case of Twitter, who I have my somewhat personal dispute with at the moment, I mean, Twitter, to get off the hook, they say that they rely on public health authorities. Okay, Twitter, well, let's see. So are you really saying that the people who populate public health authorities are gods? Are you saying that they can stand above the vibrant debate among scientists and decide and pick out in advance which will be the winning side? Is that what Twitter is saying? Because that's what they seem to be saying. And it's very noticeable that when they do pick a public authority, it's the one that they like. It's the one that suits their ideological predispositions and preferences. So, for example, you could be fairly sure that they're not going to be relying heavily on the Swedish public health authority's recommendation not to mask the general population. You could be damn sure that neither Twitter nor Facebook will be using them as a go-to source for their censorship. So, as you say, it goes in one direction. I mean, another example, and I can say this quite safely, I think, is because it's such a self-evident lie, is that some people are saying that ivermectin this has been said on CNN, that if somebody takes ivermectin, they're taking a horse dewormer. A horse dewormer. I've seen a clip from CNN of many people, and from MSNBC, and you see this on Twitter. The Federal Drug Administration, the FDA, tweeted a picture of a horse with the word ivermectin in their tweet. Now, can we just clarify something for the FDA, in case the FDA doesn't know and is not aware of this, that ivermectin is in fact a multi-purpose drug that has a veterinary version that can be used for horses, and it has a human version that is and has been used for humans for over 20 years. And so I cannot believe that the person sitting behind the Twitter account of the FDA is not aware that this is a human drug. I cannot believe that they do not know that. So I am led to the conclusion that they act out of malice and that they're willfully misinforming the public when they tweet that. Now, an FDA representative who tweets a picture of a horse beside the word ivermectin, will Twitter block their account, accuse them of misinformation, give them warnings, suspend their account completely after three charges or crimes or whatever. No, they won't. They won't. Of course, they won't.
No.
They won't because Twitter has a very clear view and a one-sided view on a number of subjects, a view that is informed by some medical experts. And the reason why people give credence to Twitter's position is because they're able to use experts to back up their views. Because it is true that some experts have affirmed the views that Twitter defends. But of course, other experts who are very eminent in their field have affirmed the exact opposite of many of those views. So Twitter basically cherry picks its experts, and then based on this cherry picking, it then says, "Oh, you said something that contradicted one of our cherry picked experts, therefore you are guilty of misinformation."
Yes, one of the gods of information, like the FDA, which I'm sure is considered on the panel of gods of information, who tweet about pictures of horses next to the word ivermectin, which is really professional. Well, interestingly, David, I don't know if you're aware, but in business, I've used quite a lot. I've used Facebook advertising previously a lot, and I've worked with clients who use Facebook advertising. And one of the great tools is the Facebook Audience Insights tool, which gives you a really interesting... if you aren't already aware, Facebook is tracking everything about you, and it's not just tracking on platform, it's tracking off platform. That's why, you can be having a conversation with your friend, all of a sudden you start seeing adverts about that thing you were talking about. That's no secret. But the Facebook Audience Insights tool enabled you to look at some of the political information that had been collected from different polls and surveys about its users. And case in point around, and there's relevance here because if you were to use the tool to search for the typical political leanings of Facebook employees, for instance, you would see that there's quite a dominant leaning towards one side of the political spectrum. Similarly, when you do the same with YouTube and Twitter. Now, you can't do it anymore. And I haven't checked recently, but a year ago I had a look, and you can no longer search specifically Facebook. So you can't use the tool on Facebook, after this Cambridge Analytica scandal. Because if you want, to me, the political leanings of each of the different platforms are pretty clear. But as a platform, we've already seen the role of these platforms within democracy. And one of my favorite books that I've referenced countless times is The People versus Tech by Jamie Bartlett, which talks about the adverse effects of these social media platforms on democracy on the basis that public perception can be skewed on an algorithm. The algorithm can be bought, and big data and different forms of behavioral science can be used to manipulate the way we see the world. And actually, it's been shown to show that people, can be lifelong voters of a particular party. They'll switch to another because of the information that they're repeatedly sent on social media. So as a researcher and lecturer of political philosophy, more broadly speaking, what role should social media play inside of the public debate when it comes to things like pandemics, which affect us all? Should it have a role? And within the scope of that role, how can this harmful effect of misinformation, this idea of misinformation censorship, how can that be mitigated against? Because I'm sure you'll agree there is genuine misinformation, there's genuinely harmful information, but the whole debate around what constitutes misinformation and harmful information is debatable. But even in the context of free speech, the idea that anything can be censored is also contentious. But from your experience in political philosophy, what are the potential pitfalls of this kind of intervention in this way, not only within pandemics, but more broadly within democracy?
Yeah, I'm going to start by saying what I think is the potential of social media, the positive potential.
Of course.
I do think that, as an example, during this pandemic, every time I tuned into television, most of the time I was bombarded with mildly veiled propaganda, and sometimes barely even veiled propaganda. Essentially with a lot of scaremongering, basically a lot of exclusive and overwhelming focus on certain types of threat. which happen to certain people in the population, certain groups in the population, but that many parts of the population are not vulnerable to that threat. But that threat was highlighted again and again and again by the mainstream media. And I got very tired of watching. I mean, honestly, I don't watch a lot of television anyway, but the few times I tuned in, all I got was content propaganda, one-sided propaganda.
This type of thing.
Yeah, exactly. So fear-mongering, unreal sort of doomsday predictions about the future going on and on, most of which were, of course, wildly overestimated. And so what can social media offer in that kind of environment? I mean, it offers us a tool that we can use to access alternative sources of information that are not being vetted by public television stations and national radio stations. You can go off the main grid, so to speak, and you can find experts and you can find informed opinion that is not perfectly aligned with what you're seeing pumped out of television 24 hours a day. And so this means that you're able to diversify your sources. You're able to triangulate, so to speak, corroborate information, find multiple sources, and see whether they check off with each other, whether they coincide. So I think there's a liberating potential that social media has, because I think diversifying sources is generally desirable, and that monopolizing information or to have monopolistic sources of information is dangerous in a democracy. So that was my first comment I wanted to make. The second point is that that's the theory of how social media could be liberating.
Yes.
But in practice, what we've seen is that social media has, in practice, basically been distilled into an oligopoly of major private companies, in particular Facebook, Google, YouTube, and Twitter, that dominate the public sphere. And if those private companies had taken seriously their responsibility towards the public sphere, their responsibility to enable and not disable a healthy public discourse, then we would not be in the situation we're in right now, where things are being censored on a whim and with no explanation, with practically no explanation. So what has happened in practice is that these companies have adopted contestable, controversial positions on a number of public issues, in particular during the pandemic, and have decided they would police their platforms to make sure that speech aligned with their ideological and political preferences, their particular scientific views, what they consider to be scientifically orthodox. And that is, they have in a way really diminished the tremendous potential of their platforms, because their platforms have become effectively, in a way, or are becoming ideological echo chambers where certain views get amplified and other views, such as mine, get kicked off the platform. And then what happens? This is the cooling effect, or the chilling effect. When other people see what happened to David Thunder, they see, oh, he spoke openly. He raised misgivings very openly about some of the vaccination campaigns, for example. But look what happened to him. He got kicked off. So those people then will restrain their discourse. And Martin Kulldorff, for example, whenever he is a vaccinologist. I mean, this is a guy from Harvard who has worked on vaccinations professionally, and is highly qualified and far more qualified than the people in Facebook or Twitter to discuss these issues. And he frequently says, if you want to hear my views about vaccination, go to my Gab account, right? The Gab platform.
Yes.
So I think we're in a very serious situation. Now, to go to what you mentioned about misinformation, do I think there could be justification for censoring certain kinds of information or misinformation? And the answer is, I do think there could be grounds for censoring certain kinds of information. And specifically, I I have in mind, in the first place, certain kinds of explicit, violent kind of imagery, graphic violence, certain images that might depict abusive behavior or sexual abuse, for example. These are harmful and abusive uses of communication that I have no problem with censoring, even though I recognize that the power of that censorship can then be abused. I'm willing to run the risk that that power could be abused in order to, because I think that harm is so serious that I believe it should be censored. Possibly another example could be if somebody was advocating that everybody should take a poisonous substance to cure COVID, right? I mean, something that was just very clearly a poisonous substance that was going to either kill them or clearly injure them. Or somebody said, for example, what people were saying in the 19th century, which is that you should be bled in order to be healed of a wide range of illnesses, that you should bleed people. Okay, modern medicine has abandoned the bleeding position a long time ago, and bleeding is still apparently used for certain very specific cases, but in general, it's been abandoned. So these kinds of views, because they could, I believe, they could lead to tangible harms, such as self-destructive behavior and other destructive behavior, there is a rationale for censoring those kinds of information or misinformation. But what Twitter has done is it's played on that moderate and somewhat sensible position, I would say. It's exploited that intuition, and it's basically said, okay, whatever we have a serious objection to is misinformation, right? That is my best attempt to interpret what Twitter is doing. Anything that we or our cherry-picked authorities could disapprove of will be misinformation. So we're talking hypothetically about this drug, right? So there's a particular drug apparently out there that some people think could be effective against COVID-19. Now, what if that particular drug, if there was good evidence to show that that particular drug is extremely safe and has resulted in very, 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 very few deaths, and it's been used for over 20 years in a routine basis. So if that's the case, then for me, the rationale for suppressing information about that particular drug just goes out the window. There is no rationale for suppressing information unless it was a very highly toxic, very, very dangerous substance, perhaps that was very risky and involved a high mortality or something like that. But if we're talking about a harmless, very, very, very safe drug, then the idea of suppressing any kind of discussion of its potential prophylactic or therapeutic uses in a pandemic, just to me is absolutely ridiculous.
I agree. However, at the same time, what you've just shared, both kind of strands of the conversation here, have highlighted how complex a discussion this is, because I may share the views that you have around the things that would be potentially harmful to others, but you could sit around a table with 20 people, 100 people, and you may not get consensus. And plus, you may also, because people have different values, different perceptions, different risk tolerances, but also different perceptions around what level of intervention a technology firm should have, or even government should have, and whether people should self-censor or So it's a very complex equation. And then the key around the drugs, the situation, it seems that, I've never come across a single drug that comes with zero risks out there. They may exist, and apologies if that's misinformation in itself. But it's people have different tolerances to risk, but even governments and regulators have different tolerators to risk. I think within this, without getting into the scientific discussion here, within this, there's a higher tolerable limit of adverse events within certain drug interventions, which would potentially be higher than under different circumstances. However, for some people, those tolerable limits are not tolerable. For other groups, they are. seemingly tolerable, that risk is deemed acceptable under the context of the wider circumstances. But to sense a discussion around that tolerance to risk and even sense of the information that could enable you to begin to assess that risk is very complicated. But I believe that's what we've seen. And speaking specifically of vaccinations, I know many of the platforms have rules that don't enable any discussion that could result in someone having an unfavorable view and therefore reject a vaccination based upon the information, even if the information is based upon pure data. I've seen just official data get censored with no comments. If the data speaks for itself and then it needs to be censored because it could be discouraging, it's not the poster who's responsible for the discouraging sentiment. Surely it's the data. So how do we make sense of all this? It's very complicated.
Yes, it is. And I believe that what's at the heart, one of the issues that's at the heart of centralization of knowledge and the centralization of, let's say, risk management is, I'm going to be blunt about this, I think it's contempt for ordinary people. I think that there is a contempt for ordinary people and communities. And let me explain what I mean. What I mean is that when somebody who is, say, a doctor or an epidemiologist or an actuary, for that matter, somebody who assesses risk, when they put their risk assessment in a godlike fashion above the risk assessments of individuals and communities, I believe that they are putting themselves in a highly paternalist relationship with local communities and citizens. And they're basically saying that citizens are either too stupid to decide for themselves what an acceptable risk is in their life, or they're morally reckless or irresponsible, for example, for visiting their relatives or for going out of their house during a lockdown. And so what has happened is that we've shifted from a traditional view of public health, which up to this pandemic was generally speaking about giving advice, which could then be tailored by people to their life circumstances, to this bizarre view that I can tell you exactly how to live your life, down to the most minute details of how many people you can have for tea in your home, how many times you can go out for exercise during the day, how long you can exercise, how many kilometers you can wander from your house. This kind of nonsense, I mean, where does it come from? I believe that it comes from an arrogant, hyper-technocratic view that says that there's an elite group of people who can engineer optimal disease outcomes by micromanaging the decisions and choices of ordinary people. Okay, and I think that goes to the heart of a lot of what we've seen during this pandemic, and it goes to the heart also of how the doctor-patient relationship has been violated, because basically what should be matters that are discussed, such as the risk of certain drugs, should be discussed between the doctor and the patient in a responsible manner, so the patient can then decide what level of risk that they're willing to assume within certain reasonable bounds. But instead of that, the authorities, in their wisdom, basically decide what risk is acceptable for everybody, for the whole population. Now, I'm not saying that there may be certain risks that are just so serious and so severe that they warrant, say, certain drugs to be prohibited outright. But I think regulators have been very heavy-handed in the way they have dealt with relatively innocuous drugs that have been branded and sold for, as I say, decades, and have been used by millions and possibly, well, let's say millions for sure. Some people say billions. Millions of people have used these drugs, this particular drug that I have in mind. And yes, regulators are clamping down on it. So I want people to understand one thing. This is not about a particular drug. It's not just about this particular vaccine or that vaccine. What we're talking about is centralized control of public discussion by people who are not angelic creatures, but are human beings who are as limited epistemically as you or I within their fields. I mean, some people are more knowledgeable than others in particular fields of expertise. But to assume that these experts who decide these matters for everybody are somehow infallible or can stand above the messiness of public discourse, that's the thing that I just find terribly naive and manipulative.
Yes. I mean, you touched on some really important points there that actually have become rather central themes of this podcast in recent weeks, actually, with many academics, many guests coming to the same conclusions around this excess centralization of power and this kind of authoritarian rule, and the technocratic approach, which essentially takes this paternalistic sense that your children, the public are young children that aren't able to make decisions for themselves, and we're the experts. We'll solve this problem in the way that we see fit. Interestingly, I spoke to my wife about this early on in the pandemic, and her view was that policies were being enacted in the way based upon this idea of human beings needing to be treated to the lowest common denominator. So for those people who may act irresponsibly, therefore, it's the classic case of the few spoiling it for the many. But the reality is, even if a few did, quote unquote, spoil it for the many and behaved extremely irresponsibly, which I don't think most people would, what would the actual net harm of that behavior would probably be minimal, because I do believe that the most of the majority of human beings are capable of making their own decisions and assessing risks if given proper, simple but proper information. And I think what we've very much lacked is proper public health information. And in fact, we might have the opportunity to pull up the Twitter terms and conditions. I've managed to get them just here. But I believe that many of the points on the Twitter misinformation policy are regularly violated by governments for misrepresenting information. But I think this is a real problem. I think this is a real problem that isn't limited to the pandemic. I think it's become a cultural norm. We've seen. I'll be interested in your comments on cultural safetyism, because again, I think that plays a role on free speech and censorship, because you get this kind of closing walls on topics. The wider cancer culture that we see, this rise of kind of excess political correctness. Where is this heading? Is there a boundary to this? Is this a warning sign for something broader that we need to be aware of?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I honestly think that there must have been a problem, an underlying problem in our culture, because of the speed with which governments jumped on the bandwagon and adopted the policies of the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, which were basically policies of mass coercion in the face of this pandemic. I mean, when I saw the Chinese government locking people up in their houses, putting police outside, I did find it shocking, actually, to see it even in China, to see that happening. And at that point, I had no conception that was going to be happening in the Western world, in the country, in Spain or in the United Kingdom or in Ireland. And I think, so one account of that would say that it's sort of, we just followed the Chinese along that path in the face of an emergency. Okay, well, there's some truth to that there was a lot of fear in the air. Governments then kind of also didn't want to look bad, and they wanted to be seen to be doing something. But I don't think that to me is too superficial an explanation. I think if our Western culture of freedom and constitutionalism was in good order, I do not think that we would have enacted any lockdown, actually. And if we had enacted a temporary lockdown, it would have been more like a kind of voluntarist recommendation that people take days off work or something like that, right? But the way it was done, building up a police state around that, suggests to me that our democratic culture, our culture of constitutionalism, the sort of preference for freedom over coercion, it's more than just a preference. It's a principled commitment to freedom that should only be overridden under very extreme circumstances. And I think that if given that happened, there must have been a rot in our culture already. And so I'm not entirely sure what the cause of that was, but I do think that there's you could argue that there's a disillusionment and a sense of purposelessness, or a lack of excitement about democracy, you might say. I mean, there's been a certain evidence for a certain level of disengagement from the political process. And in many ways, the only thing that really seemed to push people to get back into politics was anti-system kind of discourse of Trump populism, for example, and Brexit populism. That was what got people, kind of activated them and moved them into politics again, and I think helped to push larger amounts of participation. But that tells you something. That tells you that there is a deep discontent with democracy as it stands, I think. And in a sense, to be discontented with something is not exactly the same to be committed to it.
Yes.
If you know what I mean. I mean, I think it's one thing to say democracy sucks as it is. I don't like it as it is. It's another thing to say that I am firmly committed to constitutional and democracy, and I understand the value of our public institutions. That's a higher level of engagement.
Yes.
And I think if we could do this negatively, or we could do this kind of with a hypothetical, if citizens had a firm commitment to public institutions of our democracy and to the values of rule of law and constitutionalism, if they had that, then I do not think they would have been so very receptive to dictatorial, draconian, highly coercive and intrusive policies to deal with a virus.
Yes.
I don't think they would have been. So where does this leave us? What does the future hold? I mean, in a way, what we have now is we have a little hiatus from the cycle of lockdowns, at least a temporary hiatus, in the sense that, you could say partly because of the vaccine, presumably, partly because of seasonal variation. I mean, I'm not entirely sure about the net effect of the vaccine, but I'm open to the idea that the vaccine may very well have reduced the exposure of people to the risk of COVID. At least some demographics, some populations, I think, were probably helped by that. But in any case, just like last summer, we should have seen a seasonal decline. That was something to be expected. And so what I would say is that the real test is this winter, the real test of what's going to happen. I'm a little bit pessimistic, and I have to say I tend to the view that, for example, in Ireland, I believe that they're now not so open to lifting all the measures in October. They were going to lift the COVID vaccine passes in October, in the coming days. But I believe that there's some debate over that, and it's not clear that they're going to do that after all. So it's possible even that there could be more lockdowns this winter, a certain kind of lockdown at least. And in a way, the reason is because of a sickness, but it's a sickness of the mind. I mean, because we've admitted into our public culture the notion that a viral disease can be combated by locking people up, by separating them into cages. And there's the evidence is quite clear at this point that is not, just doesn't work. It hasn't worked. The countries that have done it have not fared better than the countries that have not done it. And there are lots of peer-reviewed papers to show this that tend to coincide on this point. So even the idea that lockdowns work is now scientifically very, very, very disputable, and it has a very weak grounding in evidence. So I don't want to be negative, but I suppose realistically, I do think we're likely to see more efforts to impose coercive measures this winter.
Well, I completely agree. On the lockdown point, it's been for me, it's been moralized and politicized, which I'll come back to in a moment. It's become an ideological argument. But just in the UK today, I haven't had a chance to fully digest all the material around it. But announcement made by the health secretary promoting the booster jabs in the first instance, really with a strong warning that cases are on the rise, and that it's a classic. I mean, it's predictable. I mean, once you see the patterns of behavior, you can pretty much predict what's happening. But this is the first step. You drive people to the next wave of the vaccination phase without question about why the booster is necessary if they've already had these other ones. With the illusion that will prevent further interventions. But of course, that the government's already quite clearly publicly promoted its Plan B, which includes things like vaccine passports, which I think will be the next phase when the booster rollout either doesn't go to the plan or doesn't work as effectively as they'd hoped. And then following that, when you're in the peak of winter, sadly, that's where it becomes political again, because the government, in their eyes, have to be seen to do something, and they have no other. They have to, in their minds, they have to increase the stringency somehow, even if that stringency is futile. But in the perception of doing something, it feels like lockdowns become the go-to, because it's perceived now in the public eye that this is, because I agree with your assessment of the situation quite clearly, that they certainly cause more harm than good, if any good at all. But in the public, the broad public eye, I don't think they see that. They haven't had the opportunity to look at the peer-reviewed papers and all the evidence. In fact, why would they? It's not in the press. It's not in the media. You have to be willing to go and download scientific information that perhaps the average person isn't used to assimilating. So it becomes politicized in the sense that it's a classic. The government has to do something, which I question that idea, because on one hand, the government's talking about living with the virus, which in my mind, I think about flu and how we've previously lived with flu, and how the risk profile of influenza is quite clearly variant. It varies based upon individual circumstances, but most people have a reasonable understanding of their own risk profile and therefore act accordingly. But here we are. Absolutely, I share that pessimistic view that I do believe within 4 to 6 weeks, lockdowns of some form will probably return.
Yeah, I would add to that it's not just a problem of science. I mean, that is obviously part of the problem is people's. I speak as a philosopher who is attentive to some of the scientific literature surrounding the pandemic, and who also, I would add, relies on a number of public commentators who are very qualified on this issue. So I never pretend to be an epidemiologist myself. But I do pay close attention to the literature. I look at some of the literature reviews. I also watch closely some of the analysis of a number of well-qualified epidemiologists on these subjects. But I think it goes further beyond science. It goes to the issue of good sense and prudence. And the fact of the matter is that, frankly, if somebody is imprudent, if somebody is not sensible, does not think in a very clear and sort of sensible manner, if somebody lacks vision and is unable to synthesize information, is unable to see the big picture, is unable to use their imagination to see what is going on, they could read 5,000 peer-reviewed papers and they could still come out with some very, very stupid conclusions. So in that sense, I think the issue, for example, surrounding vaccine passes, I mean, we're in a situation where we know it's very clear that the virus is endemic. it's very clear that the vaccine does not confer sterilizing immunity, meaning that the vaccine does not block infections and transmission. And there's good evidence to suggest that within a few months, even whatever transmission blocking it does diminishes quite a bit. And it might even end up more or less at the same level as say a person who's not vaccinated in terms of the resistance to transmission. I want to emphasize that I do believe, I think there's evidence that the vaccine can prevent, let's say, reduce the exposure to severe disease and death. I do believe that. But the evidence now is very clear that, for example, from Israel, that many people who are vaccinated are transmitting. And so what conclusions draw from that about vaccine passes? It basically means that if you close an area or venue and only allow the vaccinated in, you're not creating a COVID-free zone. You are not creating a COVID-free zone. That's very important to point out. That's one issue surrounding the vaccine pass. The other issue is that even if you manage to create a COVID-free zone, which is not the case, but even if we granted that, people would continue to circulate in many other social circles, and the virus would find its way through society. It would just go around that venue and move through other spaces. This is a fairly elementary point, and you can really drive it home by understanding something that is pretty much a consensus at this point, and that is that COVID transmission is very high in households. Households are hotspots for COVID transmission. So unless you're prepared to put vaccine passes at the doors of people's homes, people are going to have friends over, they're going to socialize, and the very people you turn away from your restaurants and cafes, as a friend of mine said, who is vaccinated, and she said to me, her friends are not vaccinated. They're not allowed into venues because it's Canada. And Canada is particularly dictatorial on these questions under Trudeau, the little dictator. But she said, well, we basically hang out. I hang out with my friends. I'm not going to cut off my relations with my friends. I hang out with them. So what's the net result of their vaccine pass system? Basically, that vaccinated and unvaccinated just keep mixing anyway. And if it's just the vaccinated who are the clique, they'll keep mixing and keep transmitting to each other. So it just makes no sense whatsoever.
No. I think it's a self-defeating system. It's just how quickly it will self-defeat itself, and how much propaganda around it will keep it alive, and how long that will exist for. But you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a whole hour conversation on vaccine passport. I just wanted in the last couple of minutes is closed because closed by just the fact that, unlike many who have been deplatformed, including myself, by the way, I've gone through and appealed of YouTube, have taken me down, and I do wonder, by the way, on this point, because you and I were deplatformed for the same subject matter, for the same, and again, the people I had two guests on. One was Tess Laurie, one was Pierre Corey, who presented scientific data on the screen from the papers and commented on what they were seeing. I do wonder if that data ever gets publicly accepted, whether it's through the Oxford trial or various other initiatives, whether we can go back to these platforms and say, hey, you're going to not only reinstate the account, but for myself here, actually it's we built, we reached over 5 million views, had a huge audience. If we were to properly monetize this show and build a business around the Pandemic podcast, which is what we're planning to do, we're planning to expand so we can reach more people, then that could be lost earnings, lost traction, lost reputation. I wonder if there's ever a point of acceptance where we can go back and say, well, that was not the right decision. But how can you hold these people accountable for that decision?
Well, I'm not sure. The lab leak theory is an example. I mean, Facebook was clamping down on lab leak hypothesis for a long time as the origin of the pandemic of COVID-19 and or SARS-CoV-2, and then at a certain point they just did a U-turn and said it's okay to talk about that now. So it'd be interesting to see if anybody held them to account for that.
Yes,
but because the time is short, I did want to just say that I think one important issue here is people need to start using other platforms. I would urge people to start considering alternative platforms to the standard YouTube and Twitter. I have opened a Telegram channel now that I've lost my Twitter account, and I can't go back to Twitter realistically with under a pseudonym or something. I don't think that's really realistic. So I've opened a Telegram account, which is David Joseph Thunder is my Telegram name. And that's a channel. I have 750 people signed up for that so far. And all of my channels that are open can be found at my website, which is davidthunder.com. So David Thunder, all one word, David Thunder, no spaces, davidthunder.com. You will see at the very top the various channels that I have, specifically Telegram, and I also have a blog that I've opened up on Medium. And I'm just hoping to develop these alternative platforms, but it's a collective action problem. A lot of people are going to have to get to the point where they realize they need to start moving and maybe using multiple platforms simultaneously, but we need to develop and support alternative platforms.
Absolutely, thoroughly agree. And one thing you'll find when you go to davidthunder.com is David's open letter to Twitter, which is fascinating reading, really very well articulated, and a lot of effort you put into that to send your rebuttal to Twitter. Out of interest, have you had a response to your open letter from anyone at Twitter?
No, total silence.
Gosh, goodness me. But do take the opportunity to go to David's website. That's davidthunder.com. I've posted the link to the open letter. You can go directly there. That's in the comments, both on Facebook and YouTube. You'll see that if you look out for that from our platforms. And absolutely do go and follow David's Telegram channel. David has been one of the few voice of reasons that I can turn to for real sense making around this subject, particularly around the political and social aspects of this pandemic response. So I encourage you to go and join David's channel so you can keep up uncensored around this type of dialogue. So thank you so much, David, for your third visit here on the Pandemic Podcast. It's been absolutely fantastic having you back. I'm dreadfully sorry to see your Twitter account go, but delighted that I can also follow your content on Telegram. So really, really pleased to hear that. I want to thank our audience for again participating fully in this conversation. Tomorrow we're joined by a gentleman called Jim Duffy to look at the role of blockchain and cryptocurrency, specifically on the blockchain front, what role blockchain can play in playing a role in decentralizing finance. We've talked about the impact of centralization tonight with David. We're going to talk tomorrow about the role of blockchain and how it can help decentralize that power, and how cryptocurrency can provide another mechanism of liberty and freedom for people like you and I. So I'll be back again tomorrow evening at 5 p.m. UK time. Thank you very much again for tuning in. And if you haven't subscribed to the podcast, with all the things we've just been talking about for the last hour around censorship, we've mentioned the drug by accident several times. Both David and I have both done it across this hour, which could put this show at risk. So just take 1 minute of your time to go to danjgregory.com/pandemic, enter your name and email, join our mailing list so we can reach you with our content. You can also find the Pandemic Podcast on Telegram, where we share all the episodes. So please do come and find us both on these alternative platforms and join the various mailing lists so that you can be sure that you never miss a beat and always able to receive this content. So thank you again, David. Thank you again to our audience. Good night, all, and see you again tomorrow evening.